Disney War. It's not Michael Graves. He didn't write it. James Stewart. I love the opening of this book. In the opening of the book, it talks about how the author, James Stewart, went to Disney World and dressed up as a character. He dressed up as Goofy so that he could get the experience of being as a part of the park and a part of the company. And he had a clause in the contract that he couldn't ever talk about the fact that there are people inside of the characters, because Disney really wants to keep that illusion and the magic of the characters. And that really sets the book up extremely well for what you're about to walk into, which is the total opposite of that. It's insanity what ends up happening. So my higher level takeaways for the book. It's the second time that I read it. And the first time I was absolutely fixated on every detail, because it's exactly what I want to experience, which is like the behind the scenes machinations of a multi-billion dollar company and the internal politics that end up happening. Let me talk to my microphone. The internal politics that end up happening with it, and how decisions are made, which then get things either on a screen or, any kind of product or creative endeavor that is produced has all of these different decision points that end up leading to something occurring in the world. And I think that's something that gets lost when you think about these huge multi-billion dollar conglomerates, or even a medium-sized company. If you think about the way that this American Giant sweatshirt got on me, it's a smaller team of people that develop a product, and you lose some of that whenever you think about companies as an entity and not necessarily as a group of people that work together. And Disney War really illustrates that to the deepest extent. The best part about it is that you get every single detail about people's conversations, the back channel communications. You get details about what was said to who and why, because all of the notes that were ever taken on the company, there was an early author that was going to write a book about the CEO, Michael Eisner, in the late 90s, and then James Stewart came in. But all of this stuff was released under a deposition for a lawsuit, for a multi-$100 million lawsuit over contracts that ended up coming out. And so all of this data that would have been previously locked away ended up becoming public knowledge, and James Stewart was able to write about it in the book. And so that's really setting the tone for the book. That is what's so fascinating about it, because it's taking some of the details that you would hear, and there's the same stuff happens in companies every day. But the fact that this was a very prominent company, part of why I enjoy this book so much is it talks about the exact time period of Disney films and television that I remember as a child growing up. So it really gets into the groove in the late 80s. And then in the 90s, whenever you have movies like The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast, and my personal favorite was Hercules, but Lion King, you had all of these huge blockbusters come out, which was the Disney Renaissance, which really took 10 years to come to fruition. So Michael Eisner started as CEO in 1984, and he brought in Jeffrey Katzenberg, which we'll talk about him for a little bit. And when he brought those two in, they were this creative powerhouse. They had both been successful executives. Michael Eisner was at ABC, and I believe at Paramount, and then Jeffrey Katzenberg was also a very high-level senior executive in the film industry prior to coming into Disney. I got all these notes jotted down here, but I don't want to misstate anything necessarily. But this book was started in 2001 when James Stewart wanted to write the book, and they were like, don't really care to do this. But in 2003, they had become the biggest media company in the world, and they re-engaged with James Stewart. If you see me looking back, I'm looking at at my notes in here. I want to make sure I get a lot of this stuff. Mike, I don't know if we got any luck with I'm looking at the camera thing. All right. Let me keep rolling. So the very beginning of the book actually foreshadows a little bit of what could happen towards the end of the book, because in the very beginning of the book, go Aztecs, good to see you out there, it talks about Roy Disney is setting up a coup with the board to get rid of the CEO at the time. And Roy Disney, who is the nephew of Walt Disney, wants to get rid of the current CEO and wants to bring in Michael Eisner. Michael Eisner at the time, high-level exec at Paramount, and the book goes through this condensed version of the Disney founding story, which is, they were laugh-o-gram films at the very beginning, Walt Disney basically went bankrupt twice before he founded the Walt Disney Company. And they did things very differently as a film media company, which made them very successful. And Walt Disney was obviously the creative force behind that. But Roy Disney, his brother, was also involved, and he ran the business side of things. So when you look at Jobs and Wozniak, or you look at Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, this was a very early version of that, which was you had Walt Disney, the creative, and you had Roy Disney, the guy running the business. And so the book gives like one chapter of the story, but I would highly recommend Neil Gabler did a book on Walt Disney, how he grew up, how the Disney Company was founded. And it's even longer than this book. I think it was like a 20-hour audiobook. It's a very detailed book into every little tiny part of founding the Disney Company. But if you are at all intrigued by the one chapter in the Disney War book about the founding of Disney, I would highly recommend that book. I really enjoyed it. There's a lot of biographies of Walt Disney, but the Neil Gabler one tends to be talked about as the main one to look. Sorry, Mike, I don't know why I can't get in there. So let's see. Roy Disney sets a coup to get rid of the old CEO, brings in Michael Eisner. Michael Eisner is hesitant because he is a successful executive. He's got his thing going over at Paramount, right? He was at Paramount at the time. And he was actually an ABC executive, the television channel, prior to that. So he cut his teeth in the corporate world at ABC, went to Paramount, and it listed off a number of films that he was responsible for in the 70s, which are big blockbusters now. But it said that he had the sixth sense for choosing a board or like broad audience. So he really had his fingers on the pulse of what would be successful to a broad audience, not just like art house films. And they go into his background as well. He came from money. He had a very well-off childhood, private schools. They had their house in, I don't think it was in the Hamptons, but they were a New York family with money. And he really grew up in this like cultured style. Now, he comes into Disney, and that becomes a little bit of a problem because the way that Disney operates is a little bit laid back, a little bit slower, just doesn't like to flaunt that type of thing. And so that was an adjustment for him, not as much as Michael Ovitz, but we'll talk about Michael Ovitz. So it gives a brief interview of his upbringing. And then Katzenberg was at Paramount at the same time, and they were very close and was his mentee. So Katzenberg was a mentee to Michael Eisner, and together they were this creative force where they were able to produce big things. So Katzenberg signed Indiana Jones, which other studios had passed on. He was really known for high concepts and low budgets. And there's some really good stories about his behavior and his attitude. They were talked about how Paramount was built up between Barry Diller and Katzenberg. And then Michael Ovitz was the head of CAA at the time. And all of these guys were in this same kind of this group in the early 80s. And they all end up coming back around to each other later on. So Katzenberg almost launched a separate partnership with Michael Eisner in the late 70s before they ended up going to Disney. So Roy Disney, he resigns from the board, leads the coup, gets rid of the CEO, and brings in Michael Eisner. And then there's details at this stage of Katzenberg when he gets this crazy package where he's going to get 2% of gross profits in eternity for all the films that he puts into production. And at the time, he's like, 2%, this is terrible, not a good deal. And then that ends up playing into this lawsuit really later on, where he basically is going to get paid hundreds of millions of dollars because it ended up being a great deal. Mike, the book was long but enjoyable, and the story approach, I think that's why I enjoy it so much. If it's just like details in a chapter about something that happened, I usually have a struggle to really keep up with some of the details. But when it's told in this, I think the term for it is narrative nonfiction. And there's a couple of books that I really enjoy that are going to cover this year in the book club. But this narrative nonfiction is like it's telling the entire story while giving you the details, and it's able to weave between the different players. So it gives you the perspective from Katzenberg, gives you the perspective from Eisner. It goes into Roy Disney and how he's feeling a little bit, and then there's even times where it jumps down to some of the the other higher level executives and the way that they're kind of operating between the two. And yeah, he definitely had an incredible package with the board. Now, what I found really fascinating, I'm just going to go through my bullet points here. I'm not going to hit all of them, but if Mike, you want to bring any of them up that I kind of miss on here, these pretty much go in chronological order. I was making the notes as I was listening. And yeah, Jack, we're going to do business books. This is business-ish thing, but I want to do like business and not necessarily self-improvement books, but I want to cover a different book every month, and I'll do these live streams, and I'm going to figure out how to get people into the live stream so you guys can chat too, because Mike was going to come on, but I'm having a little trouble here. So in 1984, Michael Eisner starts, and the Imagineer Club, the Imagineer team, which is responsible for all of the parks and this innovation and this creativity, they were almost eliminated right as Eisner came in. They were basically on the chopping block, and he said, no, we got to keep those because they're an important asset to the company. And I think that's fascinating now, because when I was growing up, I wanted to be an Imagineer. To me, when I learned about what Imagineers did through watching Disney Channel specials, which were like, they basically have free reign to create whatever they want and be just I don't even know what the proper term for it would be, but they could just create the magic behind the parks. And they're this very secretive group, and they basically have maybe not unlimited budgets, but the Imagineers were almost killed, but Michael Eisner kept them. So there's a lot of things that you see in the book where these long-term things that are playing out today were seeds planted back then. And you can also see how the different moves that he was making ended up shooting him in the foot later on. So Euro Disney at the time, this was what is today Disneyland Paris, was Euro Disney in 1984, and it was being talked about. They were going to put it in either Barcelona or in Paris. And so Euro Disney really became Michael Eisner's baby at this point. There was this Marriott deal on the table for the Grand Floridian down in Disney World, where they were going to build a hotel with Marriott. And then at one point they were going to buy Marriott, and then the CFO, that kind of stuff was fascinating, just to see like, well, we considered buying this multi-billion-dollar company, and then it ended up not. And that was crazy. But then the first movie that they really talk about, which was shepherded by Eisner and Katzenberg, was Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which had been turned down by other studios because it was risky. There's a lot of IP involved in the movie, and if you've ever seen it, it's got all these cartoon characters, and it's a live action mixed with cartoons, so it was extremely expensive. It had who was the director? The Back to the Future. He's directed many films, and he's well known for being an expensive but creative director. And there was some really good stories about Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and that was really the first one where you got to see like the decision-making process behind getting these films out. So at the time when they were building the studio, Disney was kind of flat and floundering, and very quickly they became a powerhouse. And there was a contract renewal that came up for Eisner, which he was then valued at over $40 million per year, becoming one of the highest paid CEOs in the world. Not Reitman. It was, he did Beowulf. He did Forrest Gump. Why am I blanking on his name? I know the director's name. Forrest Gump. He just did The Walk with Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And yeah, Wonderful World of Disney, as Mike is saying in the chat, that would actually became a really interesting story too, because Wonderful World of Disney was a way for Walt to go in front of the entire Disney audience and really address the nation and say, this is Walt Disney. But there was a point where they wanted to revive that, and they were trying to figure out who would be the actor. Is it going to be Tom Hanks? Is it going to be this, that, or the other guy? But when Michael Eisner decided to go in front and present himself as the face of Walt Disney instead of Roy Disney, who is his nephew, that seemed to be one of the turning points where you start to see the ship turn and really say like, oh, okay, things aren't going to go so well with this Eisenberg character. So at the time, there were problems in the live action, but animation was keeping all of the books looking good. They were making money off of animation, while the live action films weren't so hot. And I can't really name any 80s films from the 80s that were coming out of Disney until these guys came into power. Katzenberg was the leader behind the Miramax deal, which Miramax has made some incredible films, and some of my favorites, if you think about, I mean, they made Quentin Tarantino. Now, a lot of stuff has now come out about, why am I blanking on names? Zemeckis, that's right. Harvey Weinstein, there's been a lot of problems with him that came out later on. None of this was known back then, but it's so fascinating to really think about, people think of Disney as this family brand, but when you look at all the studios, and especially now with Star Wars, Marvel, and all the other sub-studios that are under Disney, Miramax was creating some edgy content. Actually, I don't need these headphones. Miramax was creating some incredibly edgy content and R-rated films and winning Oscars and winning awards and Golden Globes when it was technically a Disney film, but they were being shepherded under these other brands. And I think that's something that has now become standard in the industry, but at the time, that was a very new concept. And this was also very early on when they were talking about physical retail stores. So the Disney stores really started right when Eisner came in. Now, Frank Wells was the COO at the time, and you learn how pivotal he was in the process. They don't really talk about him a lot before he dies. They say, Frank Wells was kind of keeping Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg cordial with each other. He was being the buffer between the two, but really he was keeping everything running. And there's the point in, was that 1996 when that happened? Yeah, so my notes, Frank Wells, he was keeping the politics between them okay. He started this thing called Project Snowball, which they were figuring out that this deal Jeffrey Katzenberg signed for the 2% was going to be worth about $200 million in 1996. And this then comes into play later where there's a lawsuit and they talk about Project Snowball, but that was something started by Frank Wells. Yeah, the corporate deals, the cutthroat, it is so fast. It's a fascinating book. I loved listening to it, reading it as well. If you can just, the information is so just crazy. And then they got involved in the development of the Times Square redevelopment. So, my grandparents always talked about New York as this very dangerous place. And every time I go to New York for business, my grandmother's still like, "Oh, you're staying in New York." But like now it's a nice place. It's very clean. Back then, it was not. In Times Square, they were involved very heavily in the redevelopment. And then Frank Wells dies. I think it looks like my notes is about 1994 or 1993, because I know that was really a big turning point. And Katzenberg was also responsible for Toy Story. Katzenberg was really like John Lasseter is this sharp guy. We need to get Pixar. Actually, Roy Disney was really into the idea of buying Pixar at the time because they were a technology house and they needed to push animation forward. And the book really tells a story that Katzenberg is the reason that Toy Story exists. And to me, that's like, I couldn't be more indebted to a person, because Toy Story is a very big part of my life. I was at the exact age when that came out to really be a lock for that, especially with Toy Story 3. I don't want to talk about it. I get emotional talking about it. In 1994, Ovitz start popping up. Michael Ovitz runs CAA, and I'll tell you too, the book called CAA, Creative Artists Agency, came out about 2 years ago, and that's another one. If you enjoyed this book, oh man, that was a fascinating one, because that has the same like corporate backstabbing, turning deals, the machinations of Hollywood. The CAA book is really fascinating. Yeah, with 2 kids, Pixar is definitely going to be a thing in my life. We don't have them watch any, they don't watch iPads or TV or anything, but they read books, and we have a Toy Story book, so he loves Woody and Buzz based on the Toy Story book. Yeah, Mike, you had mentioned you worked at Disney World in 1974, and it was only open for a few years. Walt died in 1966, and the Walt Disney Neil Gabler biography really talks about, at the end of his life, when they bought that huge plot of land in Orlando that was really just like a barren swamp and there was nothing there. And this entire economy and city started to build up around Orlando because you had so many tourists coming in, and that really built up that area. If that's the wrong reading, you can tell me, but that's really what it seemed. The name of the book is Creative Artists Agency, or CAA. And it was like this pseudo-authorized biography and story about how CAA was founded. And at the time, in the late 90s, early 2000s, they they were the biggest name in the game. So let's see. In 1994, they were the first television studio to top $1 billion in revenue, and Eisner was this big on the synergy thing. They had the top live action, the top animation film. They had the top book produced by their in-house Hyperion, which is a Disney publisher. The top book was by Tim Allen. The top TV show was Home Improvement. Toy Story was big at the box office. And so they had all these things that all came together that took about 10 years for them to be such a big, huge success and have all of these different irons in the fire that were really firing on all cylinders. At the time in 1994, 1995, they tried to buy NBC. So that was their first really move to go and say, okay, we're going to go buy a television station, because at the time they were developing television for networks and they were selling it to networks, because that's what they do as a not a publisher, but as a studio. But this time they were like, okay, we're going to buy a network, and then we're going to be able to have this vertical integration where we have the creators over here, we get in front of the audience, we have a direct relationship with the audience, and that deal failed, but it really set the stage for eventually when they would buy ABC. And they also considered Time Warner. They were also worried that Time Warner, because at the time in the late 90s, they were one of the biggest companies in the world by market cap. They were worried that Time Warner was going to scoop them up and then essentially buy them up and subsume them into the company. So that was a concern for them. The Cap Cities acquisition happens, so they make a deal with Warren Buffett and they acquire ABC. That becomes a big point there. And as all of this is happening, Katzenberg leaves. Frank Wells dies. They buy this new studio, and this is when you get the first glimpse of Bob Iger. And Bob Iger is the current Disney CEO, which is kind of like a spoiler for the book, because in the book they say, Bob Iger was the CEO of ABC and Capital Cities, and he was like this young, hot executive at the time. And they were like, oh, he could be the CEO someday. He might not stay on. He doesn't really need to work, because when, he was involved in another deal where he was already rich. And so they're like kind of playing off of him. And then you realize many years later that he becomes the CEO. He actually isn't even the CEO at the end of this book. So I thought that was fascinating. But then they start to move to event films. So Hollywood really turns around this thing. And at the time, they were known for high concepts, low budget. And they had this this playbook for films where they wouldn't spend too much money on talent. And they wouldn't spend too much money on marketing. They would just have great films that spoke for themselves. But it moved to these big tentpole releases, which was The Lion King. Beauty and the Beast ended up having the Broadway show associated with it. And so there was a lot of stuff happening in the 90s. And as it's happening, Michael Eisner is concentrating power and pushing people out that he doesn't get along with. And it starts to show that his personality and the way that he interacts with other people is very detrimental to his long-term success, even though he feels good about it in the short term. And you get to realize that he's actually a very insecure person and doesn't really want to allow others kind of into that fold. So yeah, the 90s, that's known as the Disney Renaissance. It was definitely, that was my most formative years in film. And really the end of that was like the 1995, 97 time when, Mulan came out, and then Hercules was absolutely my favorite. I can still recite most of that film. Maybe that's a live stream. Actually, that could be like a Patreon live stream where I do a one-man show of Hercules, because I still know all those words. They then bring in Michael Ovitz, who was running CAA, and they give him this huge deal to come in to Disney. They give him a ton of money and these bonuses, and he's supposed to come in as the COO, and he wants to be president, but Michael Eisner doesn't want to be president, and he says he's going to come in as a partner. But it really goes to show that Michael Eisner was just a selfish, backstabbing type of executive. And so Ovitz comes in. He comes from a private company. Ovitz founded CAA. CAA was the most powerful company in Hollywood. Michael Ovitz was the most powerful guy in Hollywood at the time, and he comes into Disney, and this is seen as a huge coup for Disney because they're getting the most successful, the most powerful guy in Hollywood. And there's a couple of things where they try to warn Ovitz that you're operating as the officer of a public company. You can't just, spend money like you used to. You can't have your car paid for and all this stuff. And the very first thing that he does in the beginning is he throws a $90,000 art party, which is, for the talent that's associated with Disney. And you can see how he would justify it to say, I'm putting on a show for our creative talent to come and be part of the Disney company, and we've got to look good. And this is all about pumping up your chest. And so he spends $90,000 on a party, and he has 5 assistants. Just one of the assistants' jobs was sending gifts to people. And that's part of this book that I find so fascinating, is this is a whole different world that you don't have a direct exposure to, but you read about it sometimes, extravagant parties, big bills for gifts and all this stuff. And you get to see directly into that world. And so I really love that. And yeah, you got to love Michael Cord. You got to love his ballsy style, where he was just like, I'm going to buy. There was another story where he had to fix Tim Allen's, was very upset on the set of Home Improvement. And in order to win him over, he bought him this particular painting. And it was a very, very expensive painting. I can't remember what it was. It was like $5 to $10 grand or something. And that was just, he was like, all right, this is what you do. And then he also bought a watch for Bob Iger. It wasn't like a great watch, apparently. Bob Iger collects watches. And so that kind of stuff was really funny. And then you get into the late 90s, early 2000s. The Sixth Sense story was really fascinating. So they had the first shot at producing and buying The Sixth Sense from, I'm blanking on this director's name too. I know all these names. M. Night Shyamalan. And so they get M. Night Shyamalan very early. He's kind of buzzing around Hollywood, and everybody's talking about his new script, and they buy The Sixth Sense. But this tends to be the turning of the tide, where actors were getting a ton of money and options on the back end for films, and producers were racking up tens of millions of dollars. And so there's a story of The Sixth Sense where they bought it, but then they didn't have confidence in it. The guy who sold the deal was able to basically sign off on the entire thing, when really he should have went to Michael Eisner and said, here's the book. And that's another one where The Sixth Sense you wouldn't think of as a Disney film. Technically, it is a Disney film, and it ended up making them a lot of money because that was one of these mid-range adult dramas that just blew up. And I don't think there's anybody that is of, let's say over 20 years old that doesn't know I See Dead People. And, I think that's a blurry line underneath 21, unless you had a parent that wanted you to see that movie. I really like Shyamalan, M. Night Shyamalan. I really like the discussions and the stories about how ABC was coming up. And in ABC, they passed on Survivor. They passed on, what was the other one? They passed on The Apprentice. The Apprentice was started in ABC. They could have had The Apprentice, which ended up becoming a huge phenomenon, but they passed on it because the executives couldn't get their heads straight on things. I don't like to watch Muppet Babies now, but I did like to watch Muppet Babies. That's Jim Henson. That's another Disney property now. That was covered in the Jim Henson book, which I really liked. Yeah, The Apprentice. And so when they passed on the Survivor started at ABC. They just didn't go for it. And they didn't go for it because it was this big bet. They were going to film the entire show at once because you couldn't really do a pilot on The Sixth Sense. And even though they greenlighted it within Disney, they ended up nixing it, and it went to CBS. So it was still produced by ABC, but they're not getting all the benefits of running the show as well. And then other shows that started this time, Whose Line Is It Anyway? Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? The Man Show. There's a book that came out about Michael Eisner at this time where it was super sanitized and just, I don't know, it wasn't impressive at all and didn't really seem to do anything. And then talking about Survivor and The Apprentice, the Tolkien trilogy was started in the Disney properties. Harvey Weinstein he bought the rights. He wanted to make the films, but they wouldn't give him the huge budget because at the time they were going to do 2 films shot at once on a big budget. And then the way that they got rid of that was they sold it to New Line, which eventually put the film out. And Weinstein got to keep 5% of the profits or of the revenue or whatever it was. And I think that's fascinating. So then The Sopranos starts at Disney. Pearl Harbor is a Disney film. That's Jerry Bruckheimer. He's another guy who's made a lot of money off of Disney. And then Toy Story 2 comes out, and it's a huge success. And at that time, everybody is like, this Pixar guys, they work with Disney, but Disney doesn't own them. They should buy them. Then in 1999, Katzenberg's trial starts because he leaves the company and doesn't get paid that huge bonus. And there's a trial that starts because the guy who was writing the Eisner book had to hand over all of his notes. And that's when you start to learn about Project Snowball, and that's when you start to see some of the other stuff. This is when it really starts to fall apart. 1994 is when the creative side of things start to fall apart because Katzenberg leaves. But in 1999, that's when everybody seems to lose focus. and things start to kind of slide down at the beginning, towards the end. Cast of players surprised you? Yeah, Disney is very deep in the entertainment corporate world. And this, I'm going to say it again. Oh, this book is so good. Let me go back to my notes here. In 1999, the internet portal starts. They had an opportunity to invest in Yahoo, which Michael Eisner did not do. You start to see this is what it is. In 1999, the creative stuff starts to fall off of the trail. But then in 1999, Michael Eisner just makes a bunch of bad moves. He doesn't invest in the internet. I think he left I think it was 2005 that he left. He just starts to make bad moves. He doesn't invest in the internet. He doesn't sign off on big properties. They do talk about in the book where he was starting to lean on his old experience at ABC. He was like, look, I've done this before. I know how to produce great shows. And you can see that the tastes and the way that he operated never really evolved into this new world, which it was shifting in the early 2000s. He didn't want to have anything to do with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, but it became a huge success at the time. And people really gave it to him because he was trying to, he tried to pass it. The Pearl Harbor, there's a great story on Pearl Harbor and how they didn't want to pay for it. It was very expensive. And then animation films, Atlantis. I remember that movie coming out so vividly, and I remember being like, that movie doesn't look very good, but I'm still going to go see it. And it didn't do well. It flopped. And then Treasure Planet was another one. Treasure Planet, I guess, was the most expensive film. It was like the biggest bomb up to that point, especially in animation, because it just didn't make any money. So then they had a chance to buy DirecTV. That was something else that they passed up. And then talking about Eisner making bad deals, they buy Fox Family. Oh, go Aztecs. Yeah, I'm not going to... I could model more underwear. People seem to like that video. Yeah, Juan, I got more underwear coming up. That was a pouch. That was specific to pouch underwear, but I got more stuff coming. I think I'm going to do a tour of my underwear drawer, which at this point is 2 drawers. I'm going to get that one out there. Yeah, the more recent films, Mike, I did like Pearl Harbor. I like the first 20 minutes of Pearl Harbor, or maybe not 20 minutes, up to the point where they bombed Pearl Harbor. Everything after that, they should have just ended the movie. But anyway, bad investments. They didn't invest in the internet portal. They tried to build it internally. They had this like Go portal. And I remember always it was GoDisney.com or GoABC.com. And actually, and even ESPN, it was GoESPN.com. That only went away in like 2011 or 2012. That lingered on for a very long time. And Fox Family, they buy out the channel for $5 billion. They rename it ABC Family. I remember when that changed. I remember when I was very upset that the shows were changing, the lineup was changing, and they have this whole period of time where they're trying to rename that channel, and they're trying to set new programming, and there's problems with the networks, and there's all this stuff going on in the background, and they end up writing down a huge amount of that deal. I think they ended up writing down, maybe they didn't write down $3 billion, but they realized the value of the channel was like $1.5 billion after paying $5 billion for it. That was a really bad one. And that's when a lot of the executive turmoil starts to happen. You get a lot of high-ranking executives leaving, and there's a note at the end where some huge number of CEOs currently, or at least when the book was written in 2005, all had previously been VPs or higher in the Disney company, because you just saw all of these executives leaving when they realized that Eisner was not a great executive and was not letting people into the castle. He wasn't developing people, and he wasn't letting them kind of take ownership of things. All right, I'm running late on time. I'm gonna wrap it up here, because this is one of my favorite parts of the book here. Okay, yeah. So Mike, so you're 64. Bambi, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, all of those are part of your childhood. But what I love about what Disney does or did do, I remember they do the Disney Vault thing, and they would re-release films. So they would come out and say, the Pinocchio is coming to theaters for a few weeks, and here you go. And it was a great way to get new generations of people into that fold. And that's something that I'm trying to like recreate with my own children, because I do want them to appreciate traditional cell animation and traditional animation in that way, but also appreciate the new stuff. And so I've always thought about the way I would kind of introduce that stuff. But I'd say 101 Dalmatians was as important to my own childhood as maybe not The Lion King, but it's up there. So where this all collides for me is I'm a very big fan of Apple, and I've always followed Steve Jobs very closely. And there's this point where everything comes to a head, and Steve Jobs ends up being the reason that Michael Eisner gets fired. So there's this testimony where Michael Eisner goes in front of I'm not great with Senate, government, Congress, whatever, but Eisner testifies to this rip, mix, burn thing, which was an Apple ad at the time, rip, mix, burn. And Eisner is like, Apple's telling people to steal our content. And Steve Jobs, who is the owner of Pixar at the time, says this is not the way the partnership can go. And that basically puts the nail in the coffin for the partnership between Pixar and Disney as long as Michael Eisner is there. And Steve Jobs says as much. Steve Jobs says, I will not partner with Disney as long as Michael Eisner is there. And so Steve Jobs starts to go look at other options for getting this stuff, getting the partnerships taken care of. So Roy Disney at this time realizes by talking to Steve Jobs and John Lasseter that the worm had turned on Eisner. Disneyland Paris, Euro Disney was a huge failure, very expensive. The park was losing money hand over fist. The ABC, the Family Channel, all this, the stores weren't doing well. Live action films were flopping. Now, keep in mind, they just put Pirates of the Caribbean into production at this time, but they just didn't have great stuff going on, and the internet initiatives were bad. So the Toy Story sequels were written into this contract where Toy Story 1 was done by Pixar. Toy Story 2 could have been done in-house by Disney, but they didn't. But then they wanted Toy Story 3 to be a direct-to-video thing. And Steve Jobs could kind of see through the double personalities that Eisner was putting on. So I'm getting distracted by this. Getting distracted by the live chat over here. So Steve Jobs basically says, I'm not doing a deal with Disney until Eisner's gone. Roy Disney gets very upset at all of the stuff that's happening, but he says that Pixar could be this creative core and what Disney really needs right now to get back to what used to be the great part about Disney, which is original content, characters, and appealing to children. And so I love this story too. In 2004, John Lasseter wanted to create Frozen. There's a story about Snow Queen, which eventually becomes Frozen. And even when this book came out in 2000, what was the year on this book, 2005 or 2006, the story is planted in there, and Frozen came out in whatever year it did, 2014, and was a huge global phenomenon. And that started 10 years prior. My notes kind of end right there. So not only does Michael Eisner screw up all these deals, Roy Disney doesn't like him, but then Michael Eisner starts screwing up personally. There was one story where Eisner was on television with, was it with Michael Ovitz right before they fired him? And he basically lied to everybody. But then Eisner also made a comment that he had seen Walt Disney's unmarked grave. And this is when Walt's daughter gets involved to say, this dude has got to go. And so she writes a letter to the whole board. Roy Disney starts to lead this crusade with all of the other with the other shareholders in order to get rid of him. And that really starts to get rid of Eisner. But then it comes out, and this is all right at the end of the book, where Eisner really stacked the board with his own friends and with his own people. There wasn't really independence in the board. And so this is when everybody starts to really peel back the onion and find all of the problems within Disney and all the things that just weren't going well at the company. And by the end of the book, Eisner is not out at the time. At the end of the book, he's going to take a chairman role, and he's going to kind of step away. But they're worried about what kind of CEO is going to come in if he's still involved. And Bob Iger is really only considered as a potential candidate. And so at the end of the book, you really see how his rise and fall. It doesn't really cover what happens afterward. I don't think there's an updated version, because I got whatever the latest version is on Audible. But just the backdoor stuff, the behind the scenes. Jeffrey Katzenberg ends up getting a $100 million payout based on his deal and the lawsuits. I just think it's a really fascinating book, and I don't know how it directly helps me in my professional day-to-day development, other than what I did learn in this is, I just heard the quote the other day. Somebody said, you can go somewhere really fast, but if you want to go far, you have to have a team, something along those lines. And that's something that I'm more and more embracing, where if Michael Eisner wanted to be successful, he had to lean more on other people and trust them, and not, even if he was a very intelligent, sharp guy, and he knew he had this decision-making internal to him. I think he was a B player. And there's the quote from Steve Jobs where they say, B players hire C players, C players hire D players, A players only want to be with A players. And it seems over time, he was working with Katzenberg, which Katzenberg was either a B or A player, but then Eisner was concerned that he would overshadow him, or he would outsmart him, or something. And so he got rid of him, and then he just stacked everybody around him with these mediocre players. And that was really the downfall of him. Chicken Little. Yeah, I know, Chicken Little. So that is one of the takeaways from this is work with smart people, surround yourself with smart people, trust smart people. And another Steve Jobs quote is that you hire smart people so that they can tell you what to do, and not so you can tell them what to do. And I really like that. But I just love, in these things, narrative nonfiction, I think, is super readable, and it also gives you all the details at the same time. It's extremely well written chronologically. It's the kind of book that it's like, I can't believe, if I had this kind of talent, I'd be amazed here. And that's Disney War. Juan, you make that joke, but you should see the video I have going up on Friday. I'm not going to spoil anything, but So that is Disney War. I really enjoyed it. That was the second time I read through it, like I had mentioned. And the book that I'm thinking would be next, I just listened to Business Wars did a series on Nike versus Adidas, which was a great podcast. There's like a 5-part series, and I do recommend that. But I'm thinking about doing Shoe Dog again. Shoe Dog is the Nike story written by Phil Knight. I'm thinking about doing that because I need a book that I can get through quick, because it's the 14th and March is 31 days, but I'm very behind on this. And I want to make sure that I can get that live stream up pretty quickly. I did really enjoy Shoe Dog, but if you guys have any, I'm not doing a separate channel for that. I'm just going to have a video, but we'll see. If it does well, I'll probably do more. We'll see. I think there's an ASMR component to the unboxings. I think if I left the audio in and I just kind of maybe drag them out a little bit more, there could be a little bit of ASMR to them. Let's see. Okay. Mike approves of Shoe Dog. I like that. Our specialty running shop. I need to get some. I have like 300 miles on my current Asics. I'm going to have to get some new shoes pretty soon. Yes. Okay. So Shoe Dog is going to be the March one. I'll send an email out so that everybody knows that they've only got 15 days to read Shoe Dog before the next live stream. I'll make sure I live stream before the end of March. And if you want a preview or like a primer to Shoe Dog, I would check out Business Wars podcast series on Nike versus Adidas. Very fascinating stuff, because it covers the very beginnings of Adi Dassler and his brother in Germany in the very early not early Olympics, but very early when shoes started to become a big part of the Olympics and branding and advertising. And then it covers all the way up until now. So a recap of the video is coming soon. Well, I covered up. The studio is a little bit of a mess behind me right now. I was covering that up. I have a Meerman unboxing coming. I have. I can't remember what ASICs I have. I don't really want to shoot any videos. I got these pimples on my forehead. I have Mizzen and Main Seersucker coming up. They just put out their first Seersucker, so I'm gonna have like a spring Mizzen and Main video. What's else over here? The Ministry of Supply Velocity suit is out. I've got, I have an I. Taylor suit, a Hawkardy suit. I bought Charles Turret shirts. They put out slim, they have standard, classic, slim, and very slim. I have all of their shirts fitting sizes. I need to get this opened up and shoot that video. What's the other box down here? I got some wool shoes coming up. I do have some more underwear. I have a satchel and page bag that I actually have to shoot right now. I think that'll be my video tomorrow. I do have an ASMR video that I'm going to put up on Friday, so we'll see. We'll see how that goes. And let's see, I did Koyo. I did Articles of Style. Birchbox is coming up here pretty soon. And I have a bunch of boxes in my basement. I got behind around New Year's and Christmas by about a week, and I've continuously gotten a little bit more behind. I'm like 2 weeks behind. I'm like 3 weeks behind where I'd like to be. So I have a lot of boxes here that I need to get open and get those videos up. But new underwear brands. I just got Wolf underwear. What other underwear brands? The problem is I get a lot of emails about underwear brands from the companies, but I never really follow up with them. Suit videos. Yeah, I do like the suit videos. I can only have so many suits though, which is becoming a problem for like the made to measure stuff, because at some point all the made to measure companies are very, very similar. So that's my lineup. This is my mug, and I've got some other stuff. Like Wednesday videos are supposed to be my industry videos, and I'm working on I call it my supply chain, my video supply chain for those, so that I can get those out there. So I got some other stuff coming up, but if you guys, always open to suggestions. I do have some shoe videos coming up. I got some more shoe ones coming. And yeah, I do need to do some more Mack Weldon stuff because they've changed our line a little bit. I want to show each of the Mack Weldon lines and what they are, so you can kind of understand the difference between the two of them. And so, yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks, Juan. Thanks, Billy. Good to see you in there. We had 255, Placid Ear, Disney has killed creativity and originality. There is that argument to be made. I don't disagree with that. They are a big machine, but Mack Weldon, they're a great underwear brand. I've covered them a number of times. I love their air knit. Am I wearing their air knit right here? No, I'm wearing MeUndies. I should cover MeUndies too. I haven't done MeUndies in a while. I got a lot of videos that I could make. But I need to ask if I should make them. So yeah, if you search Mack Weldon Cavalier, you'll see my videos that I did on them. I really like them. This is cold now. Okay. Great chatting with you guys. I'm going to go to bed. I'm very tired. My feet are cold because I had to turn my heat off in the studio. Yeah, it's like 20 degrees right now, Mike, and my studio is heated by a wall heater, and I turned it off in order to do this. So the temperature dropping rapidly inside of here. Yeah, MeUndies does have a lot of sponsorships. This is one of my panels. So I got my sound panels up. You guys want to see the studio here? So I got some sound panels up in the ceiling to help with my audio reverberation. I built them out of wood and bath towels, and so I just have to hang this up over here pretty soon. You can see back here, this is pretty cool. I got 9 people left paying attention right now. So there's the ladder I've been using. But if you see this over on the side, this is how I'm going to be improving my unboxings going forward, because I mounted a Manfrotto pod on the wall so that I can use the base plate of my camera, so I can pop the camera on and off of the pod, and then also drop it on to the tripod, so that I can really easily shoot top-down unboxings. So I'm going to do a closet tour. I'm going to do a full studio tour once it's done. I'm still waiting for the weather to break so that I can finish the exterior of the building that I'm in currently, but I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm going to end this live stream because I will keep chatting for 20 more minutes. It was great to have you guys out here, and I will see you maybe on the 31st. I'm going to try and do it before the end of the month, but we'll do Shoe Dog, and I'll send an email out pretty soon. So great chatting with you guys. Thanks for joining. Thanks for watching as always, and stay stylish, stay classy, stay tailored, whatever you want. Stay genuine. See you, Juan. Thank you. See you, Mike. See you, Billy.